So here it is, guys, our brand new series, Keep the Faith, is taken by our very own Mark Pomeroy. So strap in for an awesome message.
Well, hey there, Elevate family and friends. Great to have you with us today. Listen, have you ever been driving along and you've had a car in the next lane, they've been just a little bit further ahead of you, and suddenly you see them start to move very gradually into your lane. And you're thinking to yourself, well, they're not indicating. That's weird. Then you realize, actually, they're drifting. And there could be a few reasons for this. You know, they're not paying attention. It could be on their phone. Boo, don't do that. Or they just could plain be a terrible driver. But whatever the reason, it's almost safe to assume that they didn't intend to drift, but rather the fact that they ended up drifting was a consequence of them not paying attention. It just gradually happened. And the reality is that in any sphere of life, if you're not paying attention, you are vulnerable to drifting. It can even happen in your relationship following Jesus, that if you're not paying attention, you'll start to drift. And chances are you've seen that happen. Chances are you've seen that happen either with someone you know, or perhaps you've even experienced that in your own life. You know, you woke up one morning and you realized it's been months since you've read your Bible, or months since you prayed, or you can't remember the last time you took a next step. You've kind of had your relationship following Jesus on cruise control. Maybe you had a season in your life where you stepped away from a church community and you didn't mean to, nothing bad happened to cause it. You just started showing up less often. Other things crept in to fill the time, and before you knew it, you had drifted. And look, in all of these things, chances are you didn't do it intentionally. You know, you didn't get up in January and start writing down your New Year's resolutions and have drifting away from following Jesus on your list. It happened because you weren't paying attention. But here's the good news. If that's ever happened to you, if you've ever drifted in your relationship following Jesus, number one, you're not alone. And number two, you are most certainly not the first. See, when you open the new part of the Bible called the New Testament, there's one letter in there, letter of instruction, called Hebrews. And it was likely written to Christian Jews, people who'd grown up in the Jewish faith and had chosen to become Jesus followers. And you know, in that culture and in that society, they experienced enormous persecution as a result of this decision. It was like they were, thought of as like betraying Judaism and betraying their family and betraying their ancestry. You know, many of them lost relationships, lost family members, contacts. Some of them lost possessions. You know, there was just this enormous amount of persecution, and yet the writer to this letter of Hebrews actually commended them for having stayed strong and having held their faith during this time of enormous persecution. And then, kind of ironically, as the persecution started to subside a little, many of these Jewish Christians started questioning whether it had all been worth it. You know, whether the sacrifices they'd made for their faith had been worth it. And some of them started drifting away from the church community. And in fact, some of them started actually abandoning following Jesus altogether and going back to their old ways. And so much of this letter to the Hebrews, when you read it, you'll discover that it is a cautionary tale that applied then and that still applies today, that we have to resist the drift. We have to remember that we don't drift because we intend to. We typically drift because we're not paying attention. And now, in the sporting world, many of you will be aware, in various sports, they have what is known as the Hall of Fame. And the Hall of Fame, sometimes it's a physical place, sometimes it's just more of a kind of ceremonial accolade given, but basically it's recognition of some of the greatest players in the history of that particular sport. Well, in this letter to the Hebrews, particularly in chapter 11, we actually come across what's become known as the Hall of Faith. Some of the most remarkable people that God used to do incredible things. Some of the most memorable people in history who demonstrated great faith. And the writer of Hebrews actually uses these members of the Hall of Faith as a means of encouragement to the audience that he was writing to, and it can also be incredibly encouraging for us today. Now, before I get into that, let me just share, probably a few years ago, we did this series called Rumble Strip. And this is a 3-week series all about resisting the drift, acknowledging and recognizing and responding to the warning signs. So I'd encourage you to scroll back through our podcast. You can find that on your favorite podcast app. Search for Elevate Church Perth and just scroll back and you'll find Rumble Strip. And that'll be a really great close cousin to what I want to talk about today. But today we're launching this new series called Keep the Faith. And over the next couple of months, we're going to take a bit of a walk through the Hall of Faith and look at some of these remarkable faith-filled individuals that God used to do incredible things and be inspired by them. So if you've got your smartphone camera, how about you scan this flow code? It's going to take you right there to Hebrews chapter 11. It's going to land us on the Hall of Faith, and we're going to start to read about and be reminded of people like Moses and Noah and Sarah and Rahab and Abraham, and the list goes on. And as was the intention of the writer to the audience of the day, it's both to be inspired, but also to just recognize that you can actually grow in faith. So wherever you are today, wherever your faith is at today, there's actually room for progress. And it's my prayer, and it's our prayer, that as we walk through this Hall of Faith, that you are going to be inspired to take next steps to see your faith grow. All right. Early on in chapter 11, verse 6 to be precise, the writer drops this explosive statement. Let me read it to you. It's impossible to please God apart from faith. And why? Because anyone who wants to approach God must believe both that he exists and that he cares enough to respond to those who seek him. Let me highlight two things. Number one, the writer says without faith, it's impossible to please God. Not difficult, impossible. And look, there's a ton of things that please God. Giving pleases God. Being generous in your life pleases God. Speaking life into other people pleases God. But the one thing that this writer says it's impossible to please God without is faith. And we'll talk about that more through this series. Also, the writer says that God responds to those who seek him. Not merely those who believe in him. In fact, Jesus himself said that even the devil believes that God exists. Of course, you need to believe that God exists, but that in itself is not enough. That's a jump-off point to then to be seeking after God and then to have the confidence that God responds to those who seek him. He'll work for you, he'll work in you, and he'll work through you if you're a seeker. Now, I'm filming this here in beautiful Perth, another sunny winter's day, what we like to call perfect weather. And we live quite close to the river, the Swan River, alongside the city. It's one of the most brilliant cityscapes and riverfronts in the world. Not biased, of course. And most mornings you'll find me down there alongside the river, running or cycling. There's a network of literally hundreds of kilometers of footpaths and cycle paths. And it's amazing. I mean, on any given morning, you might have a pod of dolphins swimming in the river just alongside the water's edge, where you are actually running or cycling. There's swans and their little babies walking across and up and down and swimming. There's all sorts of magnificent wildlife. Depending on the time of day, I might see the sun rising over the river, reflecting off the glass of the skyscrapers. I might see the full moon descending and glowing over the water. Let me tell you this, it never gets old. So it's bonkers to me anytime, and this happens a lot, that I see somebody out for their morning walk along the same riverfront that I'm walking, running, cycling, jogging along, scrolling on their phone, walking along the riverfront here in Perth, along the Swan River, scrolling their phone. Here's the reality. You miss out on so much if you don't look up. It's a problem, people. Now, by the way, just a little fun piece of trivia. This is such a problem that in South Korea, they've started installing the pedestrian lights actually on the ground rather than above eye level. Yeah? You don't believe me? Yep. Now, I realize that in life, there's a lot of things that can keep our eyes looking down. The news, relational drama, financial pressure, and on it can go. And if we're not intentional, we'll spend all of our time every day looking down and start to wonder why we feel discouraged. Start to wonder why we feel hope draining. Start to wonder if God's really actually interested in doing anything in my life. But here's the reality. If all you ever do is look down, don't be surprised when you're feeling down. See, if you want to lift your faith, you have to look up. And the writer says that faith is the confidence that we hope, that what we hope for will actually happen, and it gives us the assurance about things we cannot see. This isn't a definition of faith. This is a description of what faith does. It gives us confidence and it gives us assurance, even in things we can't see yet. But here's the reality, and here's Marco's pro tip. You won't see it, what God's doing, if you don't look up. But when you look up, you start to see different things and you start to see things differently. And the writer then says that through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. Well, no wonder so many of them made it into the hall of faith, because they lived by faith. They were known by their faith. Their lives were characterized by faith. The reality is, though, reading about their lives and reading through the hall of faith today, the risk is you can get a little bit discouraged, because, these are people who God used to overthrow kingdoms, God used to perform great miracles, and some of you find yourself reflecting on your ordinary life. This week we've had a sick puppy, and I spent a good portion of my Monday wiping runny puppy poo off various parts of our flooring. And then I read about the people in the Hall of Faith. But it's important to understand that the Hall of Faith is a highlight reel. And full disclosure, many of the people included in the Hall of Faith actually also had some pretty spectacular failures. In fact, before the highlight reel, they actually almost always had a low light reel. John Ortberg, well-known church leader and author, he riffs on just the first book of the Bible, like some of the dysfunction that played out and was recorded in just the first book of the Bible. Let me give you a flyover. Buckle up. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, so he kills him. Lamech introduces polygamy to the world, so, great content for a reality TV series. Noah got drunk and cursed his own grandson. Lot, when surrounded by intruders who wanted to sexually violate his visitors, offered up his daughters instead so the perps could have sex with them. And then later his daughters got him drunk and got impregnated by him. And by the way, he's described as the most righteous man in Sodom. Abraham played favorites with his sons, Jacob and Esau, and they became bitter enemies for 20 years. Jacob played favorites with his son Joseph and versus the other 11 sons, and so the 11 brothers ended up selling Joseph into slavery. Abraham had sex with his wife's servant and got her pregnant, and then, apparently, at his wife's request, sent the servant and the baby into the wilderness to die. Isaac and Rebekah fought over which boy gets the blessing. Jacob married 2 wives and ended up with both of their maids as his concubines, and they all got into a fertility contest. Jacob's firstborn son slept with his father's concubine. Another slept with his daughter-in-law, and when she disguised herself as a prostitute, and she dressed up as a prostitute to get pregnant because she was childless, and the reason that she was childless is that her first 2 husbands had been so wicked that God just wiped them out. Yeah, I know. It's messed up. I mean, these people need help. They need Dr. Phil. They need Dr. Spock. They need Dr. Seuss. They need something. Whew. And yet these were people that God ultimately used. And I'm wondering, are you feeling a bit encouraged by now? Like, whew, compared to them? Well, yeah, maybe. And then what's important to understand is when you get to read about them in the Hall of Faith, one thing that sticks out is God actually never then talks about their failures. And this highlights a very important principle, and that is that God's more interested in your faith than your failures. So I just want to land today. Next week, we're going to get into some of these people that made it into the Hall of Faith. And we're going to go for probably 2 months, I think, just unpacking and learning and being inspired and seeing our faith grow as a result. But let me just do a quick flyover of some very low-hanging fruit, practices, disciplines, habits, choices, lifestyle patterns that if we apply them consistently, they'll actually help us to avoid and resist the drift. One is prayer, which you can do anytime, anywhere, and it doesn't have to be complicated. Another is gathering as the church. Now, some of you are here gathering online and you're either part of Elevate and you're using sort of a hybrid approach, and great. I mean, it's fantastic to have the technology available. Whether you are live with us in Perth or you're live at another church somewhere in the world and you're also join us online, or whether online is kind of your main thing. Whatever the case is, be consistent. Bible reading. Another one, particularly these days with the Bible being available in digital form, you can read your Bible anytime, anywhere, as long as you have an internet connection and some sort of smart device. Speaking of which, how about you scan this QR code? And what this will do is it's going to take you to the My Church section in the Bible app. Now, you can then set Elevate Church as your church. And what we do every week is on a Mondays, we load a new Bible reading plan that echoes from what we've been teaching over the weekend. And I then go in and do those Bible plans. A growing number of our team and our church do those plans. I encourage you to do that. Add that to your weekly mix. Serving other people will help you resist the drift, where you understand that you're not saved to sit, but you're saved to serve. Giving financially in a generous way is another way of resisting the drift. Understanding that the income God blesses you with is about more than just accumulating more stuff. It's about being blessed to be a blessing. And one of the great spiritual paradoxes is that sometimes the greatest impact of doing these things takes place when you feel like doing them the least. You feel like doing them the least, but you need to do them the most. So I'd encourage you to join us next week, the week after, the week after, the week after. Be consistent. Come on the journey through this series, Keep the Faith. Invite somebody either physically where you are or share it with them. Hey, how about you join in? This is great stuff. You're going to learn, you're going to grow. And let's together see our faith grow and have a greater impact on the world we live in.